Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. It is about the satanic panic of the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s. It was a moral panic that began among fundamentalist Christians, but actually spread far and wide within our culture. Now, some of us still are affected by that panic. And we still worry, just as people back then did, that our neighbors are all worshiping devils, eating dogs, and killing children. Those were literally some of the fears that were afflicting our country. But those fears had really negative consequences, not only for the church, but for the criminal justice system. And the thing is, moral panics like that one tend to profoundly misunderstand the way that evil works in our world. Notice what happened in our text. We're going to unpack this a lot this morning. But notice what happened in our text. Evil did not tempt humanity to commit some huge atrocity. No. It slipped in almost unnoticed and offered humanity something that appeared to be unambiguously good. That's how evil most often works. Now, of course, we all know the rest of the story. The consequences can end up in things like, the Holocaust. That train, once it gets started, can go some really dark and really terrible places. We'll see that in a few weeks, just by looking at Genesis. But that's not where it begins. It begins in small things. Now, as we unpack this morning's text, we want to ask ourselves 3 vital questions about this text. And then there's a postscript we want to pick up. So 3 vital questions about the text, and then a final observation. And the first observation, or first question I should say, the first question we have is, who was the tempter? Who was the tempter? Now you notice that on this slide I have a subtitle, Hermeneutical Observations. And you might think to yourself, oh no, there he goes using one of those $50 words again. Hermeneutics is simply the art and science of interpretation. As the German scholar Dilthey observed, we don't just interpret texts, we interpret our experiences. So hermeneutics covers all of that. Okay? And every text in the Bible has to be interpreted. You can't just sort of say, well, I can walk straight from what this says to what it means for my life. That's how so many of our theological errors get started, in the modern world anyway. Now there's a whole nother class of errors. We'll maybe have a chance to talk about those in another lesson. But there's a whole big class of errors that start with sort of assuming that you know what this text means without going through the hard work of thinking about it. That's especially true for texts at the beginning of the Bible and at the end. Okay? And it is especially true for texts like this one, whose genre suggests that its meaning is more than historical. Not necessarily less than historical, but more than historical. In other words, the writer of Genesis is not telling us this story just to tell us about the past. He's telling us this story because he wants us to understand something about ourselves and our own experience. Now, when we are interpreting any biblical text, it is important to start with the text itself. And one of the things that we see about Genesis is, and this is very important, there are lots of questions that Genesis does not answer. In fact, doesn't even care about. When we see that kind of thing, that should get our antennae up. To say, hey, wait a minute. There are lots of things that I'm curious about that this text does not answer. I wonder what the text prioritizes. That's where you always begin when you're reading a biblical text. And too often, what we want to do is we want to skip to the end. We want to look, especially in the Old Testament, we want to read a text and then sort of forget the context in which that text occurs. We want to come over here to some favorite passage we have in Paul or Peter or something and say, oh, well, this is this. No, that's not really the way that we should approach these Old Testament texts most of the time. But sometimes it does help to look at a text from more than one vantage point. This is one of those times. I want you to observe what verse 1 says about the tempter. And I want you to, don't skip to the end, okay? Don't skip to everything that you've always been told in sermons, okay? Just look at the verse and what does it say? It says that this tempter, this person this animal, that's an important point, that is going to ask Eve this question is a serpent, is one of the beasts of the field, is the way that it's traditionally translated. The NIV renders it wild animals. And it says it's not just one of them, it is the most, the NIV uses crafty. Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. First of all, that word translated crafty is a bit of a wordplay. If you were reading this in Hebrew, the word for shame in 225 sounds a little bit like this word for crafty in 3:1. They're trying to get you to make that connection. The man and woman are without shame, and then here comes this crafty serpent. Now, what does that really mean? Well, it's a neutral term. It's not a negative term, but it can be used positively or negatively. When it's used positively, it means prudent. It means that you're using your intelligence to do something good, to produce good results, to be fruitful. Remember, that's a big theme of Genesis 1-3 is being fruitful, right? And then it's picked up again in Genesis 9, being fruitful. Well, prudence is one of the things that you use to live a fruitful life, to flourish. But when this word is used negatively, it means cunning. Now, when you're using cunning, what is it that you're doing? You're using the same faculty. You're using your intelligence, but this time you're using your intelligence to deceive. You're using your intelligence to harm, right? So that's the first thing that we learn sort of by reading this verse in its own context. The second thing I want you to just focus in on there. It says that the serpent is one of the wild animals. Now, why is that significant? Especially given what we're about to say. It's significant because this serpent is supposed to be under Eve's authority. Right? Remember Genesis 1:26 through 28? God created them male and female. He created them in the image of God, which means that He created them to rule over all those different kinds of animals. Right? So immediately, what the writer is getting you to do is he's getting you to say, wait a minute. What is this serpent who is supposed to be under Eve's rule, for whom Eve represents God? What is this serpent doing asking her this kind of question? What is this serpent doing questioning God through Eve? Eve would have been perfectly within her rights to say, that's none of your business. Go over there and do serpent stuff. Right? But now let's look at it from that different vantage point that I told you about. This is the one you've heard preached all your life from pulpits, right? The serpent is the devil, or at least it's Satan speaking through the serpent, right? That's how you've always heard this preached. That's, I think, the assumption, the broad assumption of the New Testament and of most of Judaism during that time. Now, what does that say to us? Well, Satan, the Hebrew word is satanah. It's a loan word from Old Persian, okay? It just means accuser, all right? That's what the word actually means. And so actually, when you see a translation use the word Satan in Job, for example, the word is always articular. That means it always has an article. It's ha-satan, which means that it really doesn't mean Satan, it just means the accuser, okay? That's how Satan sort of comes into biblical consciousness. He is the accuser. But by the time that we get to the New Testament, that has developed, and he has become not only the accuser of the saints, which we see that in Revelation, but he is also the enemy of God, the enemy of the church. And John chapter 8 makes it clear that this enemy is a liar and a murderer. Right? Now you might be asking yourself, okay, which is it? But that's the wrong question. Both of these perspectives are valid, and both of them are important for our understanding of the story. We start with the context itself. This serpent, this snake, has no business speaking to Eve. Not in this way. But then we also have every right to suspect, hey, there's some other devilry going on here, right? So that's our question, who is the tempter? Now, what is the tempter's rhetorical strategy? It's always important to dig into that kind of question. What is the tempter's rhetorical strategy? In other words, what is it exactly that he's trying to do to persuade the woman to take a particular course of action? Well, the first thing that we need to notice is that he attacks the weakest link. He doesn't come to Adam, who or the man, really they haven't assumed their names yet, okay? Eve especially. It's just sort of the man, the woman. He doesn't come to the man who has spent the most time with God. You know, the man spent all this time naming animals while God was trying to teach him, hey, none of these animals, not even your friendly, loyal German shepherd, is a proper companion for you, is an ezer, a helper. By the way, a word that is often used of God. And so Adam, the man, had learned by experience to trust God. The woman didn't have that experience. She is not the weakest link because she is somehow physically, emotionally, or mentally deficient. She is the weakest link because she is experientially deficient. And the tempter exploits that. Now, what's the second element of his strategy? It is to put the question to her in a light that is unfavorable to God. Look at verse 2 there. Did God really say that you're not supposed to eat fruit from any of the trees in the garden? Well, God never said anything even approaching that, right? But what's the tempter doing? What's the serpent doing? He's reframing the argument in a way that is unfavorable to God. He's already getting the woman to think about the question from the standpoint of deficiency rather than from the standpoint of abundance. And you see that in the way that she answers the question. She doesn't say, "Are you crazy? We've got all this fruit all over the garden that we can eat from." In a sense, there was no need for her to even mention the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She could have simply answered the snake's question. Just said, "We've got all of this food to eat." And if you'll remember, the way that God describes all of this in chapter 2, it is more emphatic. God does emphasize the abundance. But already the serpent has reframed the argument in a way that is unfavorable to God. The next thing that he does, the third element of his strategy, is that once he's reframed this whole conversation, he goes for the jugular. And he directly contradicts God. You are not going to die. You shall not certainly die. And here, it's really interesting. The serpent shows his hand in more ways than one. He doesn't just contradict God. He does so quoting God. Whereas the woman paraphrases God. Now, some people have made a big deal out of the fact that the woman kind of adds that whole little "nor touch it" to the I don't think that's near as big a deal as most people think it is. She's not making a law of her own or anything. Don't overread this text, okay? But she doesn't quote God. She paraphrases God. And maybe some of those subtle differences are maybe not important, but at least significant. But the serpent goes back and quotes God. That should already raise our antennae. Go, wait a minute, something's not right here. But he does so specifically to contradict God. But I want you to look there. You shall not certainly die, there in verse 4. And then he uses a little conjunction, for. Now that's usually a conjunction that presents some kind of logical connection between what goes before and what goes after, right? But the exact nature of that logical connection is a little bit, I think, a little bit unclear. The snake isn't actually as smart as he thinks he is. Because what he says is, oh, you're not going to die. For God knows that this will make you like him. Well, what the serpent seems to be implying, what the grammar would say that he's saying is, well, no, God's not going to kill you because then you'll be like him. But that's not really what the serpent is saying. What the serpent is saying is, well, God's not going to kill you. Leave that to the side. God only said this because. That's really the logical connection. So what's the because? Because God is hiding from you. He's holding out on you. There's something good that he has that he doesn't want you to have. You see what he's doing? He is questioning God's motives. He's questioning God's intentions. And in so doing, he invites the woman without ever saying so. He never says to the woman, hey, go eat some of that fruit. He never actually says that to her. Have you ever noticed that before? He never actually says that. He just does it implicitly. Implicitly, he invites her to something that is unambiguously good. There are a few tales in the ancient world about how the pursuit of wisdom can be treacherous, okay? But for the most part, wisdom was considered unambiguously good. Nobody thought wisdom was a bad thing. There were people who thought that pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, was bad. There were people who thought that money was bad. There were people who, there weren't a whole lot of people who thought power was bad either. But there were people who warned about the dangers of fame. But nobody thought wisdom was a bad thing. That's what this tempter is using. That's what this tempter is using to nudge the woman along the path of disobedience. But why does she ultimately decide to disobey? Why does she decide to disobey God? I think that's a really important question. And I think verses 5 and 6 are worthy of our serious reflection. What the writer shows us is that the decision is hers. But what the enemy has done, what the serpent has done, is he has reframed not only how she views the question that's under consideration, but also how she views that tree. You kind of get the idea from the text that actually the woman, maybe the man too, had not really paid very much attention to the tree. They just kind of walked by it every day, didn't even think about it. God told them not to eat from it, so they just completely ignored it. And now it's like the serpent has pointed her attention to it, and now she sees it all over again. It's sort of like when I'm sorry, ladies, I do a lot of these analogies from a male point of view, even though we're more women than men, but it is what it is. I'm a guy, so this is how I think about things. It's sort of like, if you're dating some girl in high school or college, and then you end up breaking up with her, all of a sudden there's all these other girls now that you see, like really see, that you didn't see before. That's sort of the thing here. She sees the tree. And what does she see? She sees that the fruit is edible. And she sees that it is, the NIV renders it pleasing to the eye. The New English translation renders it attractive. It's a Hebrew word for desire. And then, of course, in the next phrase, there's another Hebrew word for desire. Completely different word. Two words for desire. That it is desirable for wisdom, and that the fruit is just simply desirable in its appearance. Now, here's what I want you to notice. The writer of Genesis is giving us a window into the woman's decision-making process. And only one of those elements, there are three elements. The fruit's edible, the fruit's attractive, and you can get wisdom from it. Those are the three elements. Only one of those elements is something that the tempter talked about. The other two are things that she discovered on her own. I also want you to notice that whole question of desire. Is desire necessarily bad? No. God created us, in fact, as desiring people. And we desire more than we currently have. That's just part of being human. But here's the thing. The tempter has taken that natural human tendency and turned it against her. He's perverted logic. He's reframed the way that she sees God and the world. And he has turned her own desire against her. And yet at the same time, a lot of this comes from within her. And so she chooses to disobey. But there's that postscript I told you about we need to talk about this morning. We're not going to talk about it much, but we do need to talk about it. And it is simply this. Sin spreads like a disease. Now, I want you to notice there in verse 6 what's happening. The woman eats, she takes, she eats, and in the Hebrew, this is all kind of staccato. I mean, it's very da-da, 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 da-da. I mean, it's very quick. It's very rapid succession. But notice what happens. She takes, she eats, she gives some to Adam, who was with her, and he eats. So what does that teach us? Well, those of you who have heard me, you know I'm not a big fan of complementarianism. This theological theory, mostly come up with by Reformed types, that men and women are not equal. They play what they call complementary roles in creation, and mainly the roles are man leads, woman serves. Okay? I'm not a big fan of that interpretive framework. But actually here, I think it helps. Because it alerts us immediately to the fact that Adam, the man, is not doing his job. He's with Eve when all of this is going on. He, at the very least, sees the two of them talking. Doesn't he have at least the obligation to walk over and find out what they're talking about? And it's, the idea is that he maybe even be closer than that he's overheard the conversation. Does he speak up and say, "Snake, get out of here. What are you doing? Leave my woman alone"? No, he does not. And so because the man does not do his job, the woman is left to her own devices. We are better together, after all. So she disobeys, but then she gives the fruit to Adam. And like a dummy, oh, fruit. Oh, it comes from that tree over there we're not supposed to eat of? Oh, well. And sin spreads. We're going to see this theme again and again in Scripture. We don't keep our sin to ourselves. We spread it to other people. Now, sometimes it's not in such a straightforward way. Sometimes we spread our sin to other people by the ways that we hurt them. Sometimes we tempt them into doing wrong things with us, but sometimes we spread our sin to them by hurting them. And then there are myriad of other ways that we spread our sin around too. But we don't keep it to ourselves. So now, let's sort of, as we conclude, let's walk through what we've learned this morning. Let's try to be clear about this, okay? It's interesting. There is, of all the various Hebrew words that are related to sin, none of them occur in this passage. None of them occur in Genesis 3. Now, we will see one in Genesis 4, but none of them occur here. To me, that, along with the fact that the tempter's not tempting Eve to do anything particularly dastardly. He's not tempting her to, actually, join him in his rebellion and overthrow God. He's not even tempting her to commit some terrible moral atrocity. All of that together is what makes this text so instructive to me. We all have needs. We all have desires. And some of those needs are actually real. Some of those desires are actually for good things. And yet, sin will take those needs, sin will take those desires and manipulate them into something truly monstrous. Sin will take those desires and manipulate them into something horrible, something ugly, something distorted, something that is not in accordance with what God made us to be. That's what makes sin so nefarious. We a lot of times see the back end. We see when sin has done something really, truly monstrous. What we are not aware of all too often is how sin, it's all the front side stuff, it's how sin has been at work subtly undermining our trust in God, our trust in respect for other people. It has been subtly whispering lies to us. You are all you've got. This is what you really need. God cannot be trusted. And it's in that context that we are led down the primrose path to destruction. Let us pray.